I'm live. Hi, everyone. I haven't been on for a number of months. My dad and I set up The Word in the Struggle YouTube channel or YouTube series a number of months ago. And we put up 2 videos and it was a lot of fun. I think we talked about Hanukkah in one of them. I don't quite remember what the other one was. I have to remember. But um, I stopped doing that because my dad's getting older. He's 80 plus years of age. And while his memory is very good, the time it takes him to recollect and say what he wants to say was taking a long time. And he didn't feel really comfortable doing that publicly. And so I'm going to let him off the hook. But I really wanted to get back on and get these videos started. And so I've been reading the Old Testament since January. And I just recently finished Esther, the book of Esther. But during the last couple of months, I was studying the books of Kings and the books of Chronicles. And reading those books, which are usually books we often overlook or skip over, right? We tend to skip over Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, and we skip over, right? We tend to skip over Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, and we tend to skip over Chronicles. But I really took the time to start reading them, and I learned so much. I actually was fascinated by what I was reading because the books of Kings and Chronicles talks about the kings of Israel and Judah. The history from Solomon, the son of David, through Zedekiah, which was the last king of Judah before they were conquered by Babylon. Several hundred years worth of kings. I believe it was like 400 or 500 years worth of kings, actually even more than that, maybe. I don't really know. But centuries worth of kings. And I thought I would love to write a book about the kings of Israel and the lessons we should learn about them. So I thought I'd kick it off today. Surprisingly, I'm not going to start with David or Solomon. I actually did a video on King David recently on Facebook, and I'm going to see if I can save that video and post it here. See if I can figure out how to add it to this, The Word in the Struggle series. I will try to do that. But I wanted to start off with the son of Solomon, Rehoboam. And I may be pronouncing it incorrectly. Rehoboam, maybe that's the correct way of saying it. So first of all, I want to let you know, I am no expert. I don't have a degree in religion or biblical studies, though that is my passion, and I really want to get a degree in that. I just haven't been able to justify the money to put myself through college yet again for yet another degree while I'm still putting several of my kids through college. But that's something I really want to do eventually. I have always had a passion about the Bible, which I inherited from my father. And I have a passion specifically for the history of the Bible, biblical history. I really love the history of the Christian church, ancient Christian church. I love the history of the Hebrews, everything that goes on to how we ended up with the Old Testament and the New Testament today. So I'm not going to bore you too much with that, but I wanted you to know ahead of time that I don't have any sort of degree or authority to say I know what I'm talking about. Everything I'm sharing with you is available to anyone. I read the Bible. I have several commentaries that I read. I recently started reading. I mostly read the King James Version of the Bible because that's the version that my church uses the most. However, I do have other versions I read because I have an opinion about the King James Version. It is very, very outdated and old. It was written in the 1600s. And in the last 400 years, biblical scholars and archaeologists have become much, much, much better at translating ancient documents. We actually have more ancient documents available to us than we did back in that time period. And so the King James Version is beautiful and it's traditional, and that's my number one go-to. But I also like to read more contemporary versions of the Bible as well. I'm currently using the MacArthur Study Bible. I love it because it doesn't just give you the verses. And by the way, this is a New American Standard Bible. It is a widely accepted version of the Bible. It's very, very good. But it gives you not only the verses you're reading, but it also has commentary below. Really in-depth commentary, fantastic. I also have another commentary that I haven't started using yet, but I'm looking forward to it. It's the Zondervan NIV, New International Version commentary. And I have others as well. So, and a lot of it's just my own brain because I do a lot of thinking. So let's dive into it. And by the way, if you have any questions, be sure to comment and ask those questions, and I will try to answer them if I can. So we're going to dive into the first book of Kings, starting with chapter 11, and this second book of Chronicles, starting with chapter 10. So just a little background. Kings and Chronicles are mostly parallel stories about the kings and history of Israel and Judah. The reason why it's important to read both, and I read Kings, and then I read Chronicles, and then I realized I really should read them parallel at the same time, because while they tell the same stories, they each are written by different authors at different periods of time in ancient history, and they offer different insights that don't always overlap. So it's good to read both perspectives because it gives a little bit more of each story. So that's my recommendation. So let me give you a little bit of background here. I'll read some of the verses, but mostly I like to talk. So I'll probably do 90% of what I'm doing is going to be telling you the stories. And then on occasion, I will refer to a few verses. I have both of the books open in front of me on my computer. So, okay. Solomon, King Solomon. He was considered the wisest man who ever lived. That was a blessing that God gave him. I'm not going to talk a lot about him right now, but he had many, many sons from many, many wives, one of whom was Rehoboam. Now, while Solomon was still alive, he had a servant named Jeroboam. Yes, they sound very much like Jeroboam with a J, Rehoboam with an R. Okay, that is Solomon's son and heir to the throne. So during Solomon's lifetime, Jeroboam rebelled against Solomon. And it says he actually lifted his hand against the king. Obviously, he didn't succeed, and he fled to Egypt, where he stayed for a while until Solomon died. And Rehoboam was getting ready to be crowned king. So what happened was Rehoboam, in preparation for the event of becoming king, he traveled probably from Jerusalem to Shechem. Now, Shechem, I did a little research. Shechem is a very important city in ancient times. It dates way back to almost Abraham's time, possibly even before Abraham's time. It was a Canaanite city originally. But it was part of the trade routes and all of that. Very accessible to many different nations. And it was located in the time of Solomon. It was located in the tribe of Ephraim, okay, which is one of the northern kingdoms. So Judah is in the south, of Israel. Judah and the small tribe of Benjamin are in the south. The other 10 tribes are in the north. This is really important for this lesson. So Ephraim was a really big area, and Shechem was the center of the tribe of Ephraim, and what we might call today a capital. So Rehoboam heads out there. Well, Jeroboam heard that this was about to take place. He heard while he was in Egypt that Solomon died and that Rehoboam was going to become king. So he traveled to Shechem as well. Now, back when he had rebelled against Solomon, 10 of the tribes supported him. He had a great deal of support among the leaders of those tribes. And we are told that in the book of Chronicles and in the book of Kings that Jeroboam and the leaders of those tribes came to Rehoboam and petitioned him. They asked him if he could please lighten the burdens that had been placed upon the people by his father Solomon. And the taxation had been very heavy, and Jeroboam and the people requested that Rehoboam, when he became king, would lighten the load, and then they would be loyal to him. Now, before I tell you what his answer was, I need to backtrack a little bit because I jumped ahead of myself. I need to give you a little bit more history. Back when Solomon was still alive, when this rebellion was going on, there was a prophet at the time. His name was Ahijah, I believe. Ahijah, just want to make sure, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it. Ahijah traveled incognito. He was under Solomon, but he traveled incognito to Jeroboam's camp. And he told him that God wanted him to become king of the 10 tribes of Israel. He said that the Lord was angry with Solomon because he was worshiping pagan gods because of his wives. And that is what happened, is that he started off really righteous. Again, this is a story for another day. But because of his wives that came from all other different lands, to appease them, he set up altars and temples to all these different gods. And the result was that the people of Israel began worshiping these other gods. And God was not happy with that. And so the punishment was that he was going to wrest the kingdom, or a part of the kingdom, away from the house of David, away from the house of Solomon. And God had chosen Jeroboam to lead them. So Jeroboam was fully aware that God had appointed him, in a sense, to become a king in the future. So jump ahead, and this opportunity arises. But Jeroboam doesn't jump at the chance. He first goes to Rehoboam and does the right thing. Will you please lift the burden, lighten the burden of my people, and then we will be loyal to you. So here's where we get into the gist of the story. Rehoboam listened. And then he went to his father's advisors. Let me find the verse here I want to share with you. He went to his father's advisors, and who were old men. They were old men and wise, and he asked their opinion. So give me a second while I find the verse I want to share with you. Okay, so these old wise advisors of Solomon said, If thou wilt be a servant unto this people this day, and wilt serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, then they will be thy servants forever. Okay. I like what Second Chronicles chapter 10 says a little bit better. Let me find it because I just lost my spot. Give me a second here. When I'm bouncing back and forth, sometimes it gets a little confusing. All right. So I like the way it's worded in Second Chronicles 10. In verse 7, these wise counselors said, if thou be kind to this people and please them and speak good words to them, they will be thy servants forever. I like that their wisdom was to be kind. Be kind to the people and they will be thy servants forever. That's actually good wisdom for us today, right? When we're kind to others, they will help us. They will be our friends, right? I often tell my kids to be kind to those who are helping us in stores. I've seen people be treated very badly. If you want someone to help you and to be on your side, you got to be kind. Leaders, this is important, very important with leaders, to be kind to the people. But Rehoboam didn't listen. It says that he rejected their advice. He forsook their counsel. So what did he do then? He went to his peers. He went to the young people, the young men who were serving with him, probably friends he grew up with, people that he had put into his court, gave them some favors. And it says that these young men gave him a different kind of advice. It says, oh, don't do what the old men told you. Instead, you need to show your authority, show your power. Thus shalt thou answer the people that spake unto you, saying, thy father made our yoke heavy, but make thou it somewhat lighter for us. Thus shalt thou say unto them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's loins. For whereas my father put a heavy yoke upon you, I will put more to your yoke. And my father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. Yep, the young whippersnappers in the court told him to get tough. And in a sense, he was kind of justified in this because Jeroboam had rebelled against his father and he wanted to punish them. But he had a chance at peace and he passed it up. So what was the result of that? Rehoboam told Jeroboam and all the leaders of Israel that he was going to be tough. He was going to be even tougher and have a heavier yoke, heavier taxes, heavier burdens on the people than he was going to be even tougher and have a heavier yoke, heavier taxes, heavier burdens on the people than Solomon did. Well, Jeroboam and the Israelites did not like that. The result simply was that it split the kingdom. The northern tribes followed Jeroboam and made him king. And the southern kingdom of Judah followed Rehoboam. And it says that Rehoboam actually fled for his life. He left Shechem and fled back to Jerusalem with his tail between his legs. Now, here's the problem. And I didn't mention this earlier, I'll mention it now. So when that prophet, Ahijah, gave the promise to Jeroboam that he would be the king of the northern tribes, he gave him a stipulation. Let me find it just a moment here so I get it right. Okay, So Ahijah and God told Jeroboam, I'm going to make you the king under these conditions. Okay. It says, and I will take thee, and thou shalt reign according to all that thy soul desireth, and shalt be king over Israel. And it shall be, if thou wilt hearken unto all that I command thee, and wilt walk in my ways, and do that is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, that I will be with thee and build thee a sure house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel unto thee. And I will for this afflict the seed of David, but not forever. That's First Kings chapter 11. So Jeroboam was promised that he would become the king of Israel, but under the condition that he would be righteous, like King David had been righteous. And God said, I'm going to afflict the seed of David, but only for a time. It's just not forever. That's important later on. God always had promised to preserve the seed of David, and he does. He keeps that word. But that's a whole nother story for another time. Problem is, once Jeroboam became king of Israel, he was not righteous. So let me find it. There's a lot to scroll through, and I highlighted them. I just want to make sure I find the right one. So what happened was, after Jeroboam took charge of the tribes, the northern tribes, Rehoboam started gathering an army. He was going to go to war. He was told by another prophet not to do that. He was told that he should not go to war against his brethren. And because it was God's doing. In verse 23 of chapter 12, in First Kings chapter 12, let me make sure I've got that correct. First Kings chapter 12, verse 23. He says, thus saith the Lord, ye shall not go up and fight, nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Return every man to his house, for this thing is from me. Meaning the Lord knew ahead of time, he arranged ahead of time for the kingdom to be divided. It was part of the punishment for Solomon, that his kingdom would be divided. And that prophet was Shemaiah. Yes, there were multiple prophets. Now, what did Jeroboam do? He was concerned. He was not really 100% confident in his new kingship. It says in 1 Kings 12, and Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David. In other words, he was afraid that he was going to lose the kingdom. So he was concerned about that. And so particularly because obviously the Israelites were the worshipers of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of David. And so the temple was in Jerusalem, in the heart of Judah. That is where the bulk of the worship occurred. And he didn't want his people traveling into Judah. So he was afraid that all his people were going to go to Judah to perform sacrifice, and that eventually they would reject him as king and go back to Rehoboam. So what did he do? He made his own idols. It says he made 2 calves of gold, and he presented them to his people. And he said, it's too far to go to Jerusalem. It's too much of and it was a long journey. It would have taken days and days of traveling to get to Jerusalem to worship and perform sacrifice. So he made these golden calves. And he said, "Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt." And he put them in two different locations to make it more convenient for the people to perform sacrifices. He created these altars, and then more than that, he ousted the Levitical priests. So the Levitical priests, the tribe of Levi was very special. They were not like the other tribes. They were in charge of all the worship, all the sacrifices. They were in charge of the temple and everything else that had to do with worship. So Jeroboam created his own priests. He booted out the Levites. It says that he excluded them from the sacrifices, and he ordained his own priests, his own pagan priests, to do it for him. And he created his own feasts. So he definitely broke the promise that God had made to him to give him the kingship. And he did not follow in David's footsteps as God had wanted him to do. So that was problematic for him, because what happened next was amazing. Let me make sure I get this right. So now we're going to switch over to 2 Chronicles chapter 11 and find out what happened after Jeroboam rejected the Levitical priests. It says here in verse 14 that the Levites left their suburbs and their possessions and came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam had cast them off from executing the priest's office unto the Lord. So the bulk of the Levites moved south into the tribe of Judah, into the area of Judah and Jerusalem. But that wasn't all. And after them, out of all the tribes of Israel, such as set their hearts to seek the Lord God of Israel, came to Jerusalem to sacrifice unto the Lord God of their fathers. So they strengthened the kingdom of Judah. Fascinating. Okay. So I just threw a bunch of information out at you. So to summarize, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, was about to become king after Solomon died. Jeroboam, who had rebelled against Solomon, came to him with all of the leaders of the 10 tribes and wanted to make peace, wanted him to be a good king for them so they'd be loyal. He rejected that. He said, "I'm going to be tougher on you than my father." And it split the kingdom. We had the northern 10 tribes. We had the southern tribe of Judah and Benjamin. Jeroboam, who was supposed to be a righteous king, God wanted him to be a righteous king, was not. He created his own religion. He made his own idols. He booted out the Levites. The Levites moved south into Judah. And so did the righteous of all the tribes, all the people in the tribes who wanted to worship the one true God, the God of David, the God of their fathers, and they wanted to keep those laws. Mass exodus south. And it took a while. It says it took about 3 years to get everyone there. Okay, so that's the end of my story at this point. What does all this mean? What can we learn why is it important? I think we learned 3 different lessons from this whole story. Why it's all matters to us today. This is all fascinating history. Why should I care? Several different reasons. First, my first lesson, I'm looking at my notes. My first lesson is about division. I was thinking about this division. how the kingdom was split and remained split forever. The kingdoms never again healed into one nation. Except I'll have a comment on that in just a minute. When Abraham Lincoln gave his speech at the Republican National Convention in 1858, just prior to the election that made him president, he was speaking specifically about slavery at the time. He said, a house divided against itself cannot stand, referring to a verse in Matthew chapter 12. It's interesting because in that verse, Jesus, of course, Jesus was many, many, many centuries later. Jesus was talking specifically about performing a miracle, casting out devils from a person who was afflicted. And he was accused of being a devil himself. And he used this statement to say, a house divided against itself cannot stand. In other words, how can I cast out devils if I'm a devil, right? But Abraham Lincoln applied it to our nation. Our nation was divided on the subject of slavery at the time. And he believed that we should prevent that division. We should remain intact. Of course, he succeeded. It took a great war, but he kept the nation intact. Unfortunately for the Israelites, that did not happen. They were split. They were divided. But I think it's a very important lesson, not just on the level of nations, but in families, in church congregations, in communities. There are many times when we are faced with possible division, and you have to make a choice. Is it worth the division? Is it worth splitting your family or community or church congregation or group apart? When we learn more about the future of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, I would argue that the answer is no. It's not worth it. This division, even though it was a punishment from God and God set it up, according to the writers of Chronicles and Kings, it was a detrimental division that started them both on a path of destruction and wickedness, as we will see as we talk about more future kings. If they could have kept the kingdom together, if Rehoboam had answered Jeroboam differently, if he had set his pride aside and sought to keep the kingdom united, Israel may have had a very different future. We'll never know because that's not what happened. But also, excuse me, that division was caused not just by Rehoboam, but Solomon. Solomon set the wheels in motion by allowing pagan worship into his household, into his land, which it would take centuries to finally get rid of. We're going to learn a lot about how Solomon's example to his children and to his people, his weakness at the end of his life of allowing this pagan worship into his land, how that set the wheels in motion for the destruction of all of Israel. It's really sad when you see the whole picture. I apply this to family because a couple of years ago, our family was divided. Some of my kids made choices in their lives that we didn't approve of, and it led to a split in the family. The split, the division, the conflict was far more painful, far more damaging than the decisions that led to it. we had to make a choice at some point. Do we want to remain divided and have this conflict break our family apart? Or were we going to keep our family united? And we made the choice to choose, we chose the latter. And it didn't change the decisions that were made, the choices that were made. And the result of our tolerance and acceptance and love has healed our family and united our family in miraculous ways. It didn't happen overnight, but it has been a miracle. And I have never felt closer to my children. I have never felt more love from my children or for my children than I do now. And we also came to the belief that how can we ever expect our children to change their hearts through harshness? Rehoboam's answer was harsh. The Bible uses that word. He answered harshly with harsh words. And harsh words can do a lot of damage. Harsh words can do a lot of damage. Kindness, as the wise old counselors recommended, being kind is far better, has a far greater, long-lasting positive impact. So that's lesson number one. Be kind, right? And avoid division and conflict by being kind. Lesson number two, pride. Pride. Rehoboam listened to the young counselors, his friends, his peers. He didn't like what the old guys said, the wise old men. He didn't like what they said. He liked the power hungriness, the authority, the threats. Puffed up is a term that the Bible uses. He was puffed up. And his pride, he didn't want to humble himself. He didn't want to seem weak in front of Jeroboam and the other leaders. He was young. He was not even king yet. He was just about to become king. So he was trying to exert his authority. And that pride destroyed everything. Well, it didn't destroy everything. It divided everything, and he lost more than half the kingdom because of it. There's a quote here from Proverbs. Proverbs 16, by the way, the book of Proverbs is often attributed to King Solomon, who is Rehoboam's father, ironically. It says in Proverbs 16, verse 18, pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. If Solomon wrote that, how prophetic that was. Pride goeth before destruction. His son probably should have read that. I like this quote from Mark Twain. It says, wisdom is the reward you get for a lifetime of listening when you would rather have talked. Rehoboam should have listened to the wisdom of those who had worked for his father for decades, the older, wiser counselors. How many times in our lives do we fail to listen to wise counsel because maybe it's not what we want to hear? I run across this a lot. I used to write about politics in the newspaper. It's been a long time, but I did that for many, many years. And I tried very hard to be fair, and I did my research, and I would present my arguments. And what I have found over years and years of a lifetime is that when somebody has their own bias, and I teach bias in my classes, we all have bias, but when we get our mindset on something that we think is right, we shut down. We don't want to hear what other people have to say. And we try to shut them up. We've seen this in politics over and over and over again. The reality is that one side is never right 100% of the time, and the other side is never wrong 100% of the time. That's the truth. Okay, whatever your opinions are, In the old days, right, we used to be able to come together, have discussions, have debates, listen to each other, and sometimes come to compromises. We seem to have gotten away from the ability to compromise, the ability to listen, the ability to accept that, hey, maybe we're not 100% right on this issue, right? And it's caused a lot, going back to division, it's caused a lot of conflict and division in our country over the last few years. The first step to healing those divisions is being able to listen, to be able to actually hear what somebody else has to say. And more than listen, but to consider that they might have a justification for what they have to say. If Rehoboam had just listened to the wisdom of the old counselors and considered that as a possibility, but he outright, out of hand, rejected it. So that's lesson number 2, in my opinion, is to not let our pride, our biases, stand in the way of us listening to good advice, to listening to other points of view than we might have. It does take a lot of humility to be able to do that. But the sooner that we can forego pride, the better. Okay. The third lesson is the most exciting, in my view. We're going to talk about, for a moment, something that we call the gathering of Israel. The gathering of Israel. So in my church, we talk a lot about the gathering of Israel. In recent years, the phrase gathering of Israel has come to mean missionary work, sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, getting people baptized into the church, and also doing work for those who have temple work, missionary work, such like that, for people who have passed away already. So when you talk to a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and you say gathering of Israel, that's what they're thinking. They're thinking missionary work, sharing the gospel. They're not necessarily wrong, but that's not what it was originally meant. Gathering of Israel came from the prophets of the Old Testament. So I'll just kind of make this very brief and simple because I know I've been on for a while. When Abraham, God came to Abraham, told him to go to Canaan, and he promised that land to Abraham. The Abrahamic covenant is about land. This land is going to belong to you and to all of your descendants. It was a covenant from God. As the generations passed on, and of course, the Hebrews ended up in Egypt, and then Moses brought them out of Egypt and brought them back into the land of their fathers that they were promised. And they moved back in and took over the nation of Israel and all of that. That was their land, promised to them by God through Abraham. But because of wickedness, they eventually, and we'll talk about this later, but they eventually were removed from the land. God warned them over and over and over again that if they didn't repent and if they kept on sinning and kept on worshiping other gods, that he would scatter them into the nations, that he would remove them from the promised land. But he always would come back with, but I will bring you back. I will gather you back in under my wings like a hen gathers her chicks. So that was the promise. The promise was that ancient land of Canaan would belong to the descendants of Abraham, the Israelites. But if they were wicked, they would be scattered, they would be conquered, they would be removed. But third, God would bring them back again. He would not forget them. He would always remember them. And someday in the future, he would gather them back to that land of promise. Okay, it's really important to know that. So in around 800 BCE, the northern tribes were conquered by Assyria, and they were literally removed out of the land. They were taken captive into the Assyrian Empire, and eventually they were assimilated into the Assyrian Empire and lost their identities. And we call them the lost 10 tribes of Israel. They're the lost tribes. The southern tribe, the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin and Lehi, 100 years later, 150 years later, they too were conquered by Babylon. And many of them were also taken captive into Babylon. But their captivity only lasted 70 years, and they eventually were allowed to return, and many of them did return, okay, at that time, and rebuilt the temple. And they were still there at the time of Jesus and Rome, and then, but Jews had been scattered all over the world. And then, so they had been scattered. They were all over the world. By the time World War II happened, they were all over the place. So the lesson we learned from the story of Rehoboam, how does that apply? God made some promises. Let me go to those promises. I'm going to read you 3 verses in these ancient, in the Old Testament, promises to these ancient Israelites. The first one is in Isaiah 54, verse 7. For a small moment have I forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. Okay. This was written in the 8th century, about the time that the northern kingdom of Israel was taken captive into Assyria. For a small moment I have forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. Okay. Then Ezekiel 11:17 was written in the 6th century, after the Babylon conquered the tribe of Judah and took them captive. Ezekiel 11:17 says, therefore say, thus saith the Lord God, I will even gather you from the people and assemble you out of the countries where ye have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. So again, the people of Judah Israel's gone, has been gone for 150 years. And Judah has been taken to Babylon. And yet the prophet Ezekiel from exile speaks for God and says, I will give you the land of Israel. That's quite a promise. Quite a promise. And then Jeremiah, who preached just before and during that Babylonian attack and exile, in chapter 50, verses 4 through 5, says, in those days and in that time, saith the Lord, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together, Israel and Judah together, that's important, going and weeping, they shall go and seek the Lord their God. They shall ask the way to Zion with their faces thitherward, saying, come and let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that shall not be forgotten. So they're talking about the covenant of Abraham that has not been forgotten, that the Israel and Judah will come together again in Zion. So here's my thoughts on this. Okay. Again, as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints spends a lot of time talking about this gathering of Israel. Way back in 1842, I find this fascinating, although my comments do not apply just to Mormons, okay? I'm just using this as kind of a segue into my thoughts on this. But in 1842, the founder of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith, received a letter from an editor from a Chicago newspaper asking about the beliefs of the church. And Joseph Smith responded with a letter of his own, and he also provided 13 statements simplifying our basic tenets of our faith. We call them the Articles of Faith. When I was a kid, we used to have to memorize them, just like Christian kids memorize the 10 Commandments. We memorize the Articles of Faith. Number 10 started with this statement: we believe in the literal gathering of Israel and in the restoration of the 10 tribes. Okay, remember I mentioned that contemporary Mormons think of the gathering of Israel as like missionary work. We're out there baptizing people. That's not what the Bible taught was the gathering of Israel, the prophesied gathering of Israel. Joseph Smith himself understood this. He read the Bible. He understood what the gathering of Israel was. And he said, we believe in the literal gathering of Israel. The literal gathering of Israel was bringing the children of Israel back to their homeland, the land that God promised Abraham by covenant. And in the restoration of the 10 tribes, means bringing the 10 tribes, the lost 10 tribes, those that have disappeared to history. There's always talks. You can look up, there's videos about who are the 10 tribes? Where are the 10 tribes? How are we going to find them? Okay. They're gone. They're mixed in with everybody else. But Joseph Smith said one of the most important tenets of our faith was that we believed in the literal gathering of Israel, that the Israelites would return to their homeland and that the 10 tribes would be found and be restored to their homeland. Now, that was in 1842. 1842. Jump ahead 100 years. What happened in 1948? 1945, World War II ended after a horrible, horrible Holocaust. That Holocaust killed over 6 million Jews all over Europe. But it had a very interesting impact on the Jews. They started returning en masse to their homeland. And in 1858, what year was that? Yeah, 1948. 1948, 3 years after the war was over, thanks to the United States and Guatemala, they were the first ones to support the founding of the state of Israel as a nation. The gathering had already begun. People started going back there in droves, going back to the homeland. And then Israel became a nation. And I'm not going to talk about the war or anything like this. I'm not going to discuss that. That's a whole another thing that I'm not interested in discussing right now. What I want to point out is that the founding of the nation of Israel was a fulfillment of prophecy. It was a fulfillment of ancient prophecy. I just read you 3 of them. There's others. There's many, many, many other verses. There are verses in Mormon scripture that also prophesy that this was going to happen. Joseph Smith prophesied that this was going to happen 100 years before it did. So when I think of the gathering of Israel, my brain is thinking from the eyes of Jeremiah, the eyes of Ezekiel, the eyes of Isaiah. I'm thinking of the actual return of the Jewish people, the Israelite people, to their promised homeland that God gave them. Now, here's a question, right? As I mentioned, where's the 10 tribes of Israel? Where's the 10 tribes of Israel? Well, remember what I read to you. Go back. This is so amazing. I want you to think about what we were talking about before. In 2 Chronicles chapter 11, when Jeroboam rejected the Levitical priests and they left and came south into Judah, who else came with them? All of those in all the tribes who wanted to continue to worship at the temple, to worship the true God. They left en masse. There was this huge migration south of faithful followers from all the tribes. So they all mingled with the tribe of Judah. From a Mormon standpoint, this is interesting because our Book of Mormon talks, in the very beginning of it, talks about a prophet who lived at the time of Jeremiah, another prophet. His name was Lehi, and he was a descendant not of Judah, but of Joseph. Joseph and Manasseh and Ephraim were part of the northern tribes that were taken captive and disappeared. But here, Lehi was a descendant of Joseph living in the tribe of Judah. There were descendants of all the tribes living in Judah. So by the time Jesus came along, by the time World War II started, guess what? Who we think of as Jewish are not all descended just from the tribe of Judah. They are descended from all the tribes. There's a genetic mix of all the 12 tribes in the contemporary Jewish people. Because of this division and this huge migration of faithful people south, the Jewish people are descended from all 12 tribes. Therefore, it is my thinking, this is from Lori, this is the gospel according to Lori. My thinking is that the 10 tribes have already been restored. That those prophecies that the 10 tribes, and they would be restored to Israel, that Israel would be gathered, that those prophecies have been fulfilled, which is amazing to think about. So I'm going to end on that. I hope that this was interesting to you and that maybe you learned something and can apply something to your lives. I hope that this was interesting to you and that maybe you learned something and can apply something to your lives. I encourage you to read the chapters that I mentioned today. And I'll do this again maybe in a week or two after I learn about the next kings in line. We'll take it the next step. That's it. Hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.